So I come from a Jewish background, and Judaism tends to be a very secular religion. It's mainly just cultural. It's passed on from family to family with traditions. Very little explanation of anything beyond the physical. And I was always looking for a meaning that made sense to me, and I couldn't relate to the concept of a creator God that would somehow put us here and put us in a circumstance where we would suffer just to learn some kind of lesson, or to break free of that our situation of ignorance and suffer along the way to then find our way back to him. It just made no sense to me. So I was looking for some kind of answer. And my brother Andrew, he'd met Nigel, and he said, look, I've spoken to him. He's interested in deeper philosophical ideas, and maybe you should talk to him.
Okay.
And he may be able to answer some of your questions. So Andrew introduced me to Nigel, and at that stage he was writing a book that's actually not come out yet, strangely. He wasn't yet researching the grey aliens. He was writing on more philosophical and
his work does touch on philosophical and why are we here, and is there a God, and all of that sort of stuff, which we'll get into. But John, just tell us about your background.
Well, I've known Nigel since we became friends nearly 40 years ago, and I went off to do science and became a cell biologist. And during my first degree, I came across some interesting anomalies in biological science that I wanted to be able to answer, and I came and discussed some of these with Nigel over time. And really then we got into discussions over many, many years, and Nigel was putting his ideas forwards about really looking more specifically beyond the textbook at really the process of biology and how it really worked. And from that, I've always been interested in really trying to back up what Nigel's been saying by looking into science and see what sort of evidence there was for it. And in the course of these two books, and now a third, I think there is a huge amount of evidence, and I'm pretty convinced about these ideas.
Right. So you are a professor of cell biology, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Nigel does seek to align his theory with scientific knowledge. Would you say he's not?
Indeed. I mean, everything he and I and others discuss. I mean, we try to back up and say, is there evidence for this type of idea? So it's not really sort of a, one of these sort of new age ideas where we come up with a concept without any backup for it.
Okay. Now, on my show, as viewers will know, I've covered a lot of information about UFOs and alleged alien visitation, or people who claim to have been abducted. And many of those researchers that I've interviewed, very few of them, or none of them in fact, have put forward an overall complete hypothesis as to why they're here, what their program is, why did they seem to come and go out of our atmosphere, and why do they seem to take people, if that's indeed what they are doing, and what are they doing it for? They seem to, people say it's a genetics program, but Nigel actually puts forward something on the table and says, that's why they're here, this is what they're doing. And he's probably one of the only people who've actually done that, stuck their neck out, shall we say, so far to be able to. So could either of you summarize his hypothesis?
Well, looking at the evidence from Professor Jacobs and Bud Hopkins' research into abduction episodes, it does seem to be the case that these grey alien beings that people encounter in the abduction episodes, they seem to have no sense of emotion, no sense of any countenance of whatever might be going on in the people they abduct. All kinds of pain is suffered, they take people against their will, they don't seem to have any sense of conscience or any human sense of empathy with the people they abduct. And it's almost as though they're some kind of robotic entity, and that is basically Nigel's hypothesis, that that's what these grey alien beings are, that they aren't capable of an emotional sense or a sense of empathy, simply because, not because they're evil, not because they're something, they have terrible intentions, simply because they're following a program and they don't know how to be any different. So you might get there's many examples quoted in David Jacobs and Bud Hopkins' research where the grey aliens will give one of the babies to somebody to hold, one of their hybrid babies that they might have made, and they seem to be watching to see what the emotional concourse is between the woman or the man holding the child and how that affects the child. They seem to be confused. There's a look of bewilderment as to what on earth is going on. What is this strange thing called emotion?
Right.
You know?
And let's just touch on Jacobs for a moment, and also, well, Bud Hopkins you mentioned. You've studied their work, yeah?
Yes.
In detail. These are people who have interviewed and regressed hundreds, if not thousands, of abduction or abductees.
Yes.
Now, what do you say to the skeptic who says, well, look, this is all research done on people who are under hypnosis, who are possibly dreaming it, making it up, etc. You know, that it's not real things that have actually physically happened to them. How would you answer that question?
Well, I would say that there are just too many common factors that run throughout all these episodes, that if it was just a manufactured thing, there would be every individual is different. They would make up something, there would be lots of variations in the reports. And not only that, these are ordinary, down-to-earth people. It's not New Age people who want to read all kinds of weird and wonderful meanings into their own experiences. It's just ordinary people, housewives, policemen, even lawyers, politicians, whoever. All people from all walks of life, all coming up with a very, very similar episode with the same characteristics.
So just run us through one of those similar episodes with the broad characteristics that these researchers have uncovered.
Well, invariably people are taken against their will. Not against their will, they're not asked for permission. It happens before they even know it. They find themselves in a context in which they're surrounded by sometimes a tall grey alien being and a small, short grey alien being, or several of the two types. And they seem to be either doing some kind of experiment on them, looking at examining often their genitalia, sometimes removing sperm, removing ova, or they seem to be putting ideas somehow in their mind. They look at them and they seem to telepathically be transmitting some kind of message into their minds. And the whole episode really does seem to be, reminds me anyway, of some kind of experiment, like we would look at rats in a laboratory and see how they behave in certain circumstances. That's really the context it seems to be for most abductees, and very frightening too.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a scary concept for people to think about, that in the same way that we have mastered farm animals or laboratory rats, as you said, the land, etc. We are masters of our world, the human race. Could there be another master which is actually doing the same to us? What do you think about that, John?
Absolutely. I think, given the overwhelming evidence that, as Danielle was saying, you know, and the enormous number of reputable people who've been coming up with these types of claims, coupled with what happened in the press club in America, you know, where many people from radar installations to atomic stations have been saying that they've not only seen these things, but these things have buzzed their aircraft, have changed the codes on nuclear missiles, etc. I think when you have such an amazing amount of data from reputable people, it's certainly enough to convince me as a scientist that something is really going on here that needs investigation in a big way, I think.
And the other person who investigated this in detail was Professor John Mack, who died in, I think, 2007, got knocked over.
Yes.
I mean, what can you tell us about him, and how important was he to Nigel's work?
Well, as a professor of psychiatry at Harvard, he obviously had held great weight in confirming for many people the possible authenticity of these abduction reports. And so just purely from that point of view, with his reputation, I think that was that somebody of that standing took this so seriously. That's a very important thing, and he had definitely, his research was very, very valuable in confirming and illustrating to us the nature of these abduction reports.
Right. Now, in Nigel's book, in order to kind of make the case that these aliens are, they're robots, they're not beings as such, that's what the case that he makes. He tries to explain the difference between a being and a machine, which it gets quite deep. You get into philosophy and or the God verse, as he explains it.
That's right.
Just try and explain to us how he explains the difference between a living, sentient being, something which is connected to what he calls the God verse. So just explain that for us, Danielle.
Okay. Well, if you look at the nature of our universe, we're told that it started with a Big Bang, and from that point onwards, there was momentum outwards into what's due to something called the second law of thermodynamics, or entropy, into states of greater and greater separation and chaos with time. Mm-hmm. And that's the momentum that our universe, all physical things, are travelling in towards greater states of chaos. Mm-hmm. Now, if you trace that back to the original point of the Big Bang, then you would logically arrive at a point of union that's, and in fact, a point of perfect union. Mm-hmm. Now, the strange thing is that all scientists that I know of don't want to look beyond that point of the Big Bang. If you ask them, well, what happened before the Big Bang, what state was there before the Big Bang, they say they don't want to answer that question because as scientists it's not tangible, we can't measure it, we can only speculate, therefore we're not going to talk about it, we're not going to ask any questions. Mm-hmm. Now that for Nigel is the most, as far as I understand it, the most, and for me too, the most fascinating question of all. Mm-hmm. Where did all of this come from? Where did our whole existence come from in the first place? You can talk about Higgs fields and the little things that happened after the Big Bang, and everybody seems to be so fascinated with that, but really the real question is what caused it in the first place. Mm-hmm. Now, if there is a state of perfect union where there's no separation of points, which is the logical state that it would be if you trace back that momentum of drift into states of greater and greater separation, then if there's no separation of points, there's no start, there's no end, there's no time, in other words. You're talking about a timeless state. You're talking about an infinite state because there's no beginning, there's no end to it. Mm-hmm. Okay? Now, an infinite state implies that covers all possible states, including our finite universe. Mm-hmm. And it's Nigel's suggestion that that infinite state is the starting point for our existence in this physical universe, and the finite universe that we exist in is within that. So as an infinite state, it fills every state that we're in now. The presence of that infinite first state before the Big Bang is omniversal. Okay. Okay? Now, in that, if there is a state that's infinite, it has no limit, and therefore there's a state of perfect freedom. Right. And what Nigel suggests is, and it's a very secular understanding of the principle of God, which many people won't be used to, but was very attractive to me because I couldn't understand this concept of a creator God, that if there's perfect freedom, then within that perfect freedom, to do absolutely anything, there has to be the freedom to no longer be perfectly free. Right. Okay?
I think I'm following it, John.
Yeah, yeah. So if there's the freedom to no longer be perfectly free, perhaps our universe is an expression of that freedom. Right. In the complete expanse of all knowledge that infinite expression must be, there's limit within that, a possibility for limit, and perhaps we're just the result of that possibility for limit, and we've got caught in that limit.
So he draws a distinction between the physical universe and some other place or which I think he refers to as the God-verse. Is that right?
The God-verse, that is that infinite state. He calls it the God-verse because he tries, there's so many connotations attached to the word God and so on. So he tries to make it to give the sense that it's an implicate state that is not in any way directed. There's no creator God, no man with long flowing beard.
Yeah, because if you ask the question, well, God made the universe, then I just would say, well, who made God? Then people say, well, no, nobody made God. He just is. Then you could say, well, isn't the universe just is? Why does the universe need a creator if God doesn't need a creator, if you see what I'm saying? But he goes on to talk about the soul and the fact that this basically a component of beings which does not die when the physical body dies. The reincarnation, people call it, and this is he mentions quite a few cases of near-death experiences and what's the other one? Well, children who claim to come out with stories from previous lives, etc. I mean, are you a believer in that, John?
Absolutely. I think a lot of this really stems from what Danielle said. One of the connotations of this is that this state of union of all being really is where consciousness resides. All consciousness resides in principle all together. And really, because it is a state of singularity in its way, it really defines that there must therefore be its opposite, which is really a state of everything being observed from the state of separation. And therefore, within those two boundaries, universes really come about, which are really a conglomerate part of these two functions. Really a function of what is really the chaotic pole, if you like, of being, which is physicality, etc. And within this framework, you have this consciousness function, if you like, which is being mixed together in this sort of central phase of what we observe in our universe. And therefore, consciousness itself is really a function of the universe. And in such a state, it exists within, quantum physicists would talk about, for instance, potentials and actuals, collapsing wave functions. Well, the potential, therefore, for being, or what we really are, is in this potential state, and we are mixed in this place with really an atomic frame to generate what we call living beings. And therefore, because the living being is really made of the atoms, the consciousness itself, being part of a continuum, is not subject to the same forces that the atoms are, and therefore when the atoms decay due to the second law of thermodynamics, which Nigel goes into in detail, it really leaves this consciousness to then progress on its way. So,
because Nigel says that awareness and will exist outside the physical.
Yes.
So there's something outside the physical things that science can detect that is playing a role in that physical world.
Yeah.
I.e.,
I mean, physical things such as atoms and that part of the universe. If we look at really the atomic state in our universe, really I liken it to really a jar full of marbles in many ways. If we take our marbles like the atoms, really they can touch each other, but they can't really see the atoms more distant to them. So there's some sort of locality to this. But bear in mind, in terms of this jar, we could pour water into this jar, and this water is in fact a full continuum, and yet it's still a function of this jar of marbles. And what we're trying to liken this to is that consciousness, or soul, if you like, is where you have this potential in this entire continuum between the atoms. Therefore, it occupies the whole universe. It's infinite in its capacity, but it's really localized in a living system, really within the atomic frame. And therefore, when that atomic frame is actually done with or succumbs to entropy, then the consciousness remains entirely intact and away from that.
Yeah, these are quite difficult concepts to grasp. I mean, Nigel says that the soul is like a strand, as he calls it, connected to some central point. Is that right?
Well, being part of this continuum, it obviously has a and the universe actually comes from a single point, then this continuum of consciousness actually comes essentially from the beginning of the
you
universe.
see, if that initial point is timeless, if we came from a state of pure awareness and perfectly free will to start with, and that state is timeless, then by definition it goes on forever. And if we from that perfect freedom made the choice to explore the nature of separation and limit with our awareness and our will, then our awareness and will would be an information field that started at that point and then traced a path all the way through our existence into a physical separated state.
Right.
And that's how Nigel would define a soul, and does define it in his books, as an information field, a line of connection back to that eternal state that pre-existed the nature of capturing a physical universe.